Hey there, welcome back. Go ahead, get comfortable, dim the lights, grab a blanket, maybe something warm to sip. Unless you're one of those night owls who thrive on cold tea and chaos. Tonight, we're setting sail into the murky waters of the past. Literally. Because tonight's story is about pirates. But not the yo-ho-ho kind. Not the Johnny Depp eyeliner kind either. We're talking about female pirates. And before you roll your eyes and think, oh, you mean Anne Bonny and Mary Read? Yes, we'll get to them, obviously. But they weren't the only ones. There were others, dozens, maybe hundreds, whose names barely survived the waves of history. Some were fierce, some were accidental, and a few were just there because they got on the wrong ship at the wrong time. But the question that really keeps people up at night, and the reason you clicked on this, is what actually happened to these women when they were caught? Were they tortured, hanged, married off to some lucky or unlucky sailor, or did they somehow cut a deal with the crown, trading their freedom or their crewmates for a pardon? The answer, like most things in history, is it depends. And it's probably not what Hollywood wants you to imagine. So let's ease into it. Picture the sea, gray, endless, and just slightly too cold. The smell of salt, wood, and regret. And a woman standing on the deck of a ship that's about to be boarded. Her name? Could be Anne, or Mary, or maybe someone history forgot to write down. But her story, that's the one we're about to tell. Let's start with a basic truth. Piracy was never meant to be romantic. It was messy, desperate, and, more often than not, completely miserable. The sea was not kind. Food spoiled, scurvy happened, and when the Navy showed up, it usually didn't end with a polite, "you're under arrest." For most pirates, male or female, capture meant death. But for women, it got complicated. See, 17th and 18th century societies didn't quite know what to do with a woman who didn't follow the script. Women were supposed to be quiet, obedient, and ideally at home. Not commanding ships, robbing merchants, or stabbing officers in the Caribbean. So when the rare female pirate was caught, authorities tended to panic just a little. Because executing a woman was uncomfortable, especially if she was young, or pretty, or pregnant, or even just claimed to be pregnant, which, as we'll see, was a surprisingly popular strategy. Let's drift to one of the most famous examples, Anne Bonny and Mary Read. They're practically the Beyoncé and Rihanna of pirate history. And they're always mentioned together, which is kind of poetic, because their lives and fates were tangled in ways that history still can't completely unravel. Both were captured in 1720, off the coast of Jamaica, when their ship, the Revenge, was taken by pirate hunters. Their captain, Calico Jack Rackham, was hanged soon after. But Anne and Mary, they had one last card to play. They claimed to be pregnant. And, as it turns out, 18th century English law had a rule, a very strange one, called pleading the belly. If a condemned woman was pregnant, her execution was delayed until after she gave birth. In theory, this was out of compassion for the unborn child. In practice, it was a loophole that often bought time, sometimes enough for someone to pull a few strings, bribe a few guards, or just disappear altogether. So both Anne and Mary pleaded their bellies, and both were granted temporary stays of execution. Mary Read died in prison soon after, probably of fever, though some versions say childbirth complications. Anne Bonny? Well, that's where things get fuzzy. Some say she was hanged later, others say her wealthy father intervened and got her released, and a few more romantic tales claim she lived quietly somewhere in the Carolinas, had children, and died old, which sounds nice but is probably fiction. Still, Anne Bonny's name lingered like a sea breeze, strong, slightly salty, and impossible to get rid of. But what about the others? The nameless, the forgotten, the women who didn't have a famous captain or a sympathetic backstory? Well, let's just say the record gets darker. Take Jeanne de Clisson, a 14th century French noblewoman whose husband was executed for treason. She sold everything she owned, bought 3 warships, painted them black, and personally hunted down French nobles, murdering them in revenge. She was known as the Lioness of Brittany. If that sounds metal, that's because it was. Eventually, when her rage cooled or her resources ran out, she disappeared into obscurity. No record of torture or capture, just a quiet fade into history's background. Then there was Grace O'Malley, the Irish pirate queen of the 1500s. She was powerful enough to negotiate directly with Queen Elizabeth I, face to face, in the English court, while refusing to bow. Elizabeth spared her life because even monarchs recognized that Grace was not someone you messed with. And honestly, that's probably the closest anyone in this story gets to a deal with the crown. But not every pirate queen got off that easy. For every Grace or Anne, there were dozens of women who ended up hanged, drowned, or quietly erased. One account from 1721 describes Mary Cricket, a female pirate hanged in England. The report barely gives her a paragraph, just a list of her crimes, a note that she confessed and expressed repentance, and a mention that she was buried under the gallows. No fanfare, no romance, just one more name on a long list. And then there's the particularly grim case of Rachel Wall, considered the first American-born female pirate. She was tried and executed in 1789 in Boston, and her last words reportedly were, "I have been guilty of a great sin, but I die with a clear conscience before God and man." Which is about as calm a final statement as you can give before being hanged in public. But here's the weird part, and maybe the part that makes all of this just a little bit haunting. While male pirates were often seen as villains, female pirates were treated almost like curiosities. Newspapers described them with a mix of disgust and fascination. Pamphlets about Anne Bonny and Mary Read sold very well. Even their trials were attended like theater. Societies seemed to be simultaneously appalled and obsessed, which, honestly, hasn't changed much, because a woman with a sword defying every expectation of her time is still one of the most powerful and unsettling images in history. Let's float for a moment out at sea. The ship creaks. The ropes sway. Somewhere a lantern burns low. And you can imagine her, the captured pirate sitting in her cell, chains around her wrists waiting to learn her fate. Does she think about the gallows? Does she think about her crew scattered or dead? Or maybe she just stares out through the bars and thinks, well, that escalated. Because that's the thing about history's female pirates. Most didn't plan to become legends. They were survivors, opportunists, or fugitives who found freedom in chaos. And when the crown came calling, they faced the end the same way they faced the sea, head on. Let's drift a little further into the next part because the story doesn't end at the gallows. We'll explore what society did with their memory, how the legend of the female pirate became entertainment, moral lesson, and fantasy all at once. Because sometimes, even when history tried to hang them, these women refused to disappear. The price of freedom, or a rope. So, let's drift gently back to the docks of Port Royal, or maybe London, or some hot mosquito-riddled corner of the Caribbean where everything smelled faintly of rum and regret. Because by the early 18th century,
what we call the golden age of piracy, the British Empire had officially decided that fun on the high seas was over. Pirates were no longer charming rogues or rebellious merchants. They were now enemies of the state, and the noose had become a very popular fashion accessory. But, and here's where things get interesting, not all pirates were treated equally, especially not the women. See, female pirates were rare enough to make people confused. Were they criminals, victims, or just too scandalous to process? The legal system, built entirely by men who wore wigs big enough to house a family of birds, didn't quite know what to do with a woman who'd just spent years robbing ships and shooting sailors. Let's float through a few of their stories. Anne Bonny, who we already met, was captured in 1720 alongside Mary Read and their rather useless captain Calico Jack Rackham, whose greatest talent seemed to be dying attractively. When the British Navy cornered their ship, Anne and Mary fought to the end, while the men, as usual, hid in the hold. After their capture, they were taken to Jamaica, tried for piracy, and sentenced to hang. But here's the twist. Both women pleaded their bellies. That was 18th century legal code for, "I'm pregnant, and you wouldn't dare hang a pregnant woman, would you?" And it worked. Their executions were delayed indefinitely. Mary Read, unfortunately, died in prison not long after, likely from fever, though some legends whisper she took poison rather than face the rope. Anne Bonny, on the other hand, simply vanished. There's no record of her hanging, none at all. Some say her wealthy father, a once disgraced Irish landowner who still had connections, paid for her release. Others think she changed her name, remarried, and lived out her life quietly on some plantation, watching ships fade into the horizon. Either way, Anne Bonny managed to pull off what very few pirates ever did. She got out alive. And that was rare, especially for women. Because if a female pirate wasn't pregnant, noble-born, or connected to someone powerful, her fate was usually simple: execution. Sometimes public, sometimes quietly done, depending on how much embarrassment her existence caused the local governor. But here's the strange part. Despite their crimes, these women often became curiosities, objects of fascination. In newspapers, pamphlets, and gossip circles, they were described in wild contradictions: too feminine to fight, too monstrous to be a woman, too clever to be real. Writers would call them savage temptresses one minute and innocent maidens led astray by wicked men the next. It was as if society needed to rewrite their stories just to sleep at night. And that rewriting wasn't new. Back in the 16th and 17th centuries, there had been whispers of other female sailors, some real, some exaggerated. Grace O'Malley, the Irish pirate queen, actually met Queen Elizabeth I face-to-face, demanding that her captured sons be released. She refused to bow, refused to speak through a translator, and refused to remove her dagger in the Queen's presence. Elizabeth, probably impressed and mildly terrified, granted her request. Now imagine that. Two powerful women negotiating empire and rebellion over tea. One in lace and jewels, the other smelling of salt and gunpowder. Not quite your average royal meeting. But let's drift back to those who weren't so lucky. When female pirates were caught, their trials often became theater. Crowds would gather just to see what a real female pirate looked like. Judges would ask absurd questions about their clothing, their hair, or even whether they'd worn men's breeches, because apparently that was the true crime. The actual murders, thefts, and mutinies, secondary. The real horror to the gentlemen of the court was that these women had dared to exist outside their assigned box. And so, many of their punishments were designed not just to end their lives, but to erase their reputations. Bodies buried in unmarked graves, records altered or lost, names twisted into legend, until truth and rumor blurred together like the horizon at dusk. Let's drift for a moment, because it's easy to forget that piracy wasn't just chaos and greed. For many, it was survival. The Caribbean in the 1700s was a world of impossible choices. You could work on a plantation and die of heat and debt. You could join the Navy and be flogged for breathing incorrectly. Or you could take a ship, grab a cutlass, and live by your own rules, at least for a little while. For women, those choices were even narrower. They could marry, serve, or starve, unless they were bold or desperate enough to break the rules entirely. And that's what makes the few women who turned pirate so endlessly fascinating. They weren't symbols of freedom, they weren't feminist icons before their time. They were just human. Angry, clever, flawed, and utterly unwilling to die quietly. Let's drift now toward a few more forgotten figures, the ones history barely bothered to name. There was Jeanne de Clisson, the Lioness of Brittany. After the French government executed her husband for treason in the 1340s, Jeanne sold her lands, bought 3 warships, painted them black, and went on a decade-long revenge spree against French vessels. She reportedly left 1 survivor from each ship just to spread her message. Her banner? A black flag with blood-red sails. So yes, before the Jolly Roger, there was Jeanne. And unlike most pirates, she eventually retired peacefully. Apparently, vengeance had an expiration date. Then there was Saida al-Hura, a Moroccan queen who partnered with the infamous Ottoman pirate Barbarossa. She ruled a port city, raided Spanish ships, and, just to make her story even better, married the king of Morocco but refused to leave her own court. He had to come to her. And why not? She had the fleet. Let's take a deep breath here, because by now you might notice a theme. Most female pirates weren't born criminals. They were widows, exiles, or women cornered by systems that gave them no place to stand except the deck of a stolen ship. They made choices that history found inconvenient. And when those choices led to capture, the question wasn't just punishment, it was containment. How do you stop an idea that women could command, fight, or live by their own code? Simple. You erase it. That's why so few of their names remain. That's why every time one appears, she's half myth, half memory. And yet, every few decades, one resurfaces in stories, plays, or bedtime monologues like this one. Let's float on to the final stretch, the afterlife of the legend. Because even if history forgot their real faces, their ghosts still sail on, reshaped by storytellers who couldn't quite let go.
In every novel about rebellion, in every bedtime whisper about freedom and defiance, because deep down, humanity loves a rebel, especially one who wasn't supposed to exist. Let's drift, just for a moment, to the gallows at Port Royal again. That human afternoon in 1720, when 2 women stood before a crowd, sentenced to die. One of them, Mary Read, pale, fevered, clutching her swollen belly. The other, Anne Bonny, staring down the men who had tried to tame her. According to the record, before she was led away, Anne turned to Calico Jack Rackham, her lover, her captain, her co-defendant, and said, "If you had fought like a man, you needn't have been hanged like a dog." It's a line so perfectly cinematic, that historians argue endlessly over whether she actually said it. But that doesn't matter, because even if it's fiction, it's the kind that feels truer than truth, the kind that echoes through time, across oceans, through ink and smoke until it lands quietly in your ear centuries later. That's the legacy of female pirates. They were inconvenient in life, mythologized in death, and unforgettable in legend. And maybe that's the best kind of immortality, the kind that doesn't ask for statues or songs, just a whisper carried by the waves. So as we close tonight's voyage, imagine the sea at dusk, the horizon melting into violet haze, a single black sail far away, catching the last light before it disappears. And maybe, just maybe, that's Anne, or Mary, or Jean, or Qing Shi, still sailing. Not ghosts, not sinners, not saints, just women who refused to sink quietly. Thanks for drifting with me tonight, friends. Until next time, sleep well, and may your dreams stay just a little bit lawless.
The Ghosts of the Sea. How female pirates became legend. So, let's settle in for the final drift. The part where the waves quiet down, the wind gets softer, and the story turns from fact into something more like memory. Because after the 18th century, female pirates stopped being people and became symbols. And like all symbols, they were rewritten, reimagined, and, of course, misquoted by every historian trying to sound clever. By the early 1800s, piracy itself was fading. The empires had gotten bigger, the navies stronger, and the oceans, ironically, less free. But in the cultural imagination, pirates were just getting started. Painters, playwrights, and penny novelists started digging up the bones of those old stories. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Jean de Clisson. They were no longer criminals. They were romantic rebels, bold, beautiful, misunderstood. Basically, the Taylor Swift versions of 18th century outlaws. Of course, the reality was far less charming. Most of them probably smelled like tar, sweat, and despair. But still, it was more fun to imagine them as fiery redheads with perfect eyeliner, sword in hand, wind dramatically blowing their hair. The Victorians, who were weirdly obsessed with moral decay and corsets, adored these stories. They'd write long poems about lady pirates, usually ending in either death or redemption. Because heaven forbid a woman just live free. No, she had to die beautifully, whispering something poetic about the sea. Then the 20th century came along and gave us movies. And suddenly, the female pirate was reborn again, now as a fantasy archetype. Half warrior, half seductress, still surrounded by men who either wanted to fight her, kiss her, or both. She was dangerous, but glamorous. And let's be honest, that image sells better than the truth. But the truth is still worth whispering about. The truth is that these women, the real ones, were survivors in a world that didn't allow them to exist as they were. They weren't chasing treasure. They weren't seeking fame. They were clawing for a kind of freedom most people never tasted. And that's why, centuries later, their stories still wash up on our shores. Let's float through one more name before we dock the ship. Her name was Qing Shi, though you might also see her called Zheng Yi Sao. She wasn't European. She wasn't even technically a pirate queen in the Caribbean sense. She was a Chinese woman who, in the early 1800s, commanded one of the largest pirate fleets in history,
Over 70,000 sailors. Yes, 70,000. That's more than the population of many cities today. She started as a courtesan, married a pirate lord. When he died, she took over his fleet and made it even bigger. She built an entire pirate code, a legal system at sea that punished theft, protected women, and distributed loot fairly. Her men feared her more than the emperor himself. And when the Chinese government finally realized they couldn't defeat her, they offered her something unthinkable: a pardon, complete forgiveness for every crime she'd ever committed, on the condition that she retire. And she said yes. She took her money, married again, opened a gambling house, and lived comfortably into old age. She died peacefully. No torture, no execution, no romanticized martyrdom. Just quiet success. The ultimate pirate move, escaping history itself. That's the thing about these women. They defied categories. Each one existed between myth and flesh, legend and survival. And even though most of them were written out of the official record, they linger in every stormy sea story.
The forgotten ones. The women history misplaced at sea. Hey, still awake? Good. Let's drift a little longer. The waves aren't done talking yet. Because while names like Anne Bonny or Qing Shi get carved into the driftwood of legend, there were hundreds, maybe thousands, of women who slipped through the cracks of history entirely. They didn't have pamphlets written about them or court records or ballads. They just existed briefly, burned bright, and were gone. And honestly, that might be the truest pirate story of all. Most female pirates weren't captains. They weren't even supposed to be there. They were cooks, deckhands, lovers, stowaways, or just women who refused to be left behind when their world collapsed. Some disguised themselves as men, binding their chests, lowering their voices, and learning to fight like the sailors beside them. Others simply boarded ships that didn't care who they were, as long as they could pull their weight. And while the men sang songs about freedom and brotherhood, the women lived the quieter version, the one made of scraped palms, sleepless nights, and pretending they weren't terrified. But let's meet a few of them, the ones history only half remembers. There was Grace O'Malley, the Irish pirate queen long before Anne Bonny ever set foot on deck. Born into a noble Gaelic family in the 1530s, she commanded ships along the wild coast of Connacht. She was part sailor, part smuggler, part warlord. And she met Queen Elizabeth I face to face, two women who ruled very different worlds, speaking across a gulf of politics and pride. Elizabeth came draped in lace and authority. Grace arrived barefoot, with a dagger strapped beneath her gown. The guards tried to confiscate it, of course. She reminded them, politely, that she never traveled unarmed. It's said that during their meeting, Grace refused to bow, because technically she didn't recognize Elizabeth as her queen. A bold move, especially when you're standing in the middle of the English court. But somehow, it worked. Grace got her family pardoned, her ships returned, and she sailed home, the only pirate in history to out-negotiate a queen. Now let's float to the Caribbean again, where a woman named Fanny Campbell turned pirate almost by accident. It's the early 1800s. She's American, and her fiancé has been captured by pirates. So, what does Fanny do? Obviously, disguise herself as a man, steal a ship, and go rescue him. Because apparently, sensible options weren't in fashion. She succeeds, by the way. She rescues him. Then, because they already have the ship and the crew, they decide to keep pirating for a bit. You know, for fun. It's one of those stories that historians argue over. Was she real, or a myth built from half-remembered tales? But that's the funny thing about pirate history. It's all half-remembered. Because no one was writing these women's stories while they lived. They were too busy trying not to die. Let's drift even farther now, to the chilly waters of the North Sea. A woman named Ingela Gothamhelm, Swedish, early 1700s. She wasn't your typical pirate either. She was a privateer, technically, meaning she had government permission to rob ships belonging to the enemy. It's like state-sponsored piracy with better paperwork. When her husband died, Ingela took over his fleet. The Swedish crown, expecting her to crumble, instead found themselves negotiating with one of the most successful maritime raiders of the era. She lived comfortably, died peacefully, and was buried in a stone tomb with her husband, whose skeleton, according to local legend, sits upright, forever guarding her grave. Because, of course it does. Every story like this carries that same whisper of irony. Women stepping into a world that kept trying to throw them back out, and somehow making it bend. And that's the real secret to why their stories linger. They weren't just fighting men. They were fighting the shape of history itself. Let's move gently, almost imperceptibly, to another thought. What it actually meant to be a woman on a pirate ship.
It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't romantic. It was damp, filthy, and dangerous. Food was scarce. Sickness was everywhere. Privacy didn't exist. And when storms hit, which they did often, survival came down to sheer luck. But still, for some women, it was better than the alternative. Better than poverty. Better than servitude. Better than being told every single day what they couldn't do. Out there, under the endless horizon, they could at least choose their own danger. And maybe that's why they risked everything. Even in the ancient world, there were whispers of sea women. Norse sagas that mentioned shield maidens who took to the waves, or traders' wives who fought beside their husbands on longships. We don't know how many of them were real and how many were legend. But honestly, at this point, does it matter? Because the legend keeps something alive, a sense of possibility that the world keeps trying to bury. And that's really what this whole story has been about, hasn't it? Not just piracy, not just rebellion, but the small, stubborn act of saying, no, I'll go my own way. We'll end soon, but not yet, because before we do, we need to talk about one more thing. What happened after the end? What became of their legacies, their descendants, their ghosts, both real and imagined, still drifting in saltwater memory? We'll get there next. For now, take a breath. Let the sea rock you softly, because the final tide is coming in, and with it, the last glimmers of the pirate women who refused to disappear.
The afterlife of the pirate queens. Myths, ghosts, and modern echoes. Still here? Good. The sea hasn't gone quiet yet. There's one last stretch of this story, the part where time blurs and legend starts to wear the same clothes as memory. Because when you live your life outside the law and often die before 40, history tends to get creative with the details. That's how the pirate women went from real, flesh-and-blood sailors to something softer, shinier, and just a bit ghostly. They were gone, but not really gone. Just rewritten. Let's start with Anne Bonny again, because of course we do. The end of her story is one of history's best open-ended mysteries. The court records stop after her imprisonment in Jamaica. There's no execution record, no grave, no final note saying she was hanged on such and such date. So naturally, people started filling in the blanks.
Some said her father, a wealthy merchant back in Ireland, bribed her release. Others claimed she escaped disguised as a servant, fled to the Carolinas, and lived a quiet life under a false name. One legend even says she ran a tavern by the sea, occasionally smirking when a sailor would boast about that pirate Anne Bonny. No one could ever confirm it, but in a way, that's what makes it perfect. Anne's entire life was about refusing to be pinned down, even by history. Then there's Mary Read. Her story, unfortunately, seems more final. She died of fever in prison just after giving birth. Her child didn't survive either. Her grave, marked simply Mary Read, 1721. And yet, she too became a myth. Painters romanticized her. Writers softened her rough edges. In the 19th century, she reappeared in adventure novels as a kind of dashing heroine, brave, beautiful, misunderstood. The same woman who once stabbed a man for calling her pretty was now being painted with long curls and a wistful gaze. History really does love irony. Let's drift east again, to China, where Qing Shi's story aged differently. She didn't die in chains or at sea or even poor. After retiring from piracy, yes, she retired, she opened a gambling house in Guangzhou and lived out her days in peace. Her legend, though, became mythic. The Pirate Queen of the South China Sea, a name whispered in coastal villages long after her death. Even the Qing dynasty, who once declared her an enemy of the empire, quietly avoided saying her name too loudly afterward, because some reputations just stick to the air like salt. Her ghost, they say, still sails in misty dawns, a red-sailed junk appearing and vanishing before sunrise. People claim to hear the faint sound of drums or the echo of her voice giving orders. And if that sounds too poetic to be true, well, that's the whole point. Pirate stories were never about truth. They were about freedom. The idea that someone, anyone, could live by their own rules, even for a moment. But here's where it gets interesting. When you follow these women's stories forward into modern times, you start seeing their shadows everywhere. In early cinema, they became stock characters. The lady pirate, always with perfect hair and suspiciously clean boots. In the mid-20th century, pulp novels turned them into symbols of rebellion and sensuality. And today, they show up in video games, Halloween costumes, and motivational Pinterest quotes. Be the captain of your own ship. Sure, Anne Bonny would probably laugh herself sick reading that on a coffee mug. But beneath all that pop culture fluff, there's something genuine that still glows. A kind of quiet admiration. Because even centuries later, we still look at these women and think they shouldn't have done it. But I'm glad they did.
They became metaphors, symbols of resistance, icons for every woman who was told to sit down and decided instead to grab the wheel. Even their supposed punishments got rewritten. Some folklore says female pirates who were hanged never truly died. They became sea spirits, protectors of sailors. Or, depending on the storyteller's mood, tempests who dragged wicked men under the waves. There's an old Cornish legend that says if you see a single gull flying beside your ship during a storm, it might be the ghost of a pirate woman watching over you. No one ever explains why she'd bother, but I like to think it's because she still can't resist the sea. Now, let's talk about the quiet legacy, the historical kind, the one with ink instead of legend. Modern maritime law, especially the way it treats piracy, still uses language rooted in the 18th century. Enemies of all mankind. It's dramatic, but oddly poetic. And buried deep in those old admiralty codes are cases involving Anne, Mary, and others. small legal fossils of their existence. Those dusty words are the last official traces of them. Not their faces, not their graves, just ink. But maybe that's enough, because that ink, in its own way, kept them alive. Even now, archaeologists and historians keep finding little things. A scrap of fabric here, a name carved into a plank, a weapon with initials too faded to read. And every time someone whispers, maybe it was hers. We'll never know, of course, but that's the beauty of it. They've become part of the ocean, half history, half story. So where does that leave us, here at the end of the tale? Just watching the tide roll in, same as always. The pirate women are gone, but the questions they left behind still float. How much freedom is worth dying for? How much can you defy before the world breaks you, or you bend it instead? They lived briefly, burned brightly, and vanished, leaving behind only whispers and waves. And if you ever find yourself by the shore, late at night, with the wind in your hair and the moon caught in the surf, listen, because maybe, just maybe, you'll hear the echo of laughter, low, distant, unafraid. Women who never asked permission, still sailing somewhere beyond the horizon. And with that, you can rest. The sea is calm now. The story's done. And tomorrow, the waves will forget again. But you won't.
Echoes beneath the waves. So, that's where we'll leave them. The queens of the storm. Women who refused silence, who stole their freedom one wave at a time, and then vanished, laughing into salt and legend. When you close your eyes tonight, imagine them, not as ghosts, but as motion, as wind in torn sails, as the sound of rope tightening before dawn, because they were never meant to stay still. Anne Bonny, Mary Read, Ching Shi, names once whispered in fear, now murmured in awe. Every one of them carved her story into a world that didn't want her to exist, and somehow she made it listen. And maybe that's the real treasure they left behind. Not gold, not fame, but proof. Proof that history's rules were never unbreakable, just waiting for someone reckless enough to test them. Every era has its seas. Every generation its pirates. They might not carry swords anymore, maybe just microphones, protest signs, or lines of code. But the fire's the same. Defiance still smells like salt and thunder. So next time you walk by the shore or look out over dark water, remember, there were women who once ruled it, who sailed without permission, who looked the world in the eye and said, "You don't get to decide who I am." And even though the tide erased their footprints, their stories still ride every wave that reaches us. Pause. Faint sound of creaking wood and distant waves. Thanks for drifting through history tonight. If the sea has taught us anything, it's that the past never really sleeps. It just whispers. Until next time, this is the Sleepless Historian, reminding you, some legends sink, and some keep sailing.